Hi, everybody. Dropping this little clip for the Rick Mast Show. You know, with the announcement, with Martin Truex announcing that he retired last week, I wanted to maybe go into a little bit of detail to you guys about what a driver's lifespan is in Cup, right? So, a lot of aspects to this, but we got to look at the driver's lifespan, and one of the things that I call it Cup drivers years, or driver's years. You know, you've got human years, you've got dog years, where the dog years equal 7 years a dog lives for 1 year to a person. Well, a driver's life is like that to some degree. It's not 7 years, but it's a point there to where, you know, you're living longer than a year. In other words, if you live a year as a Cup driver, you really, in dog years or driver years, you're probably a year and 2 months into that. So, you know, if you're there 10 years, you've aged 12. If you're there 15 years, you've probably aged, 18 years, right? And the reason for there's many reasons for that, but like in Ryan's case, you have financial stability. Let's back up. When a driver retires or gets out, there's usually 3 or 4 reasons. Number one, he's hurt or killed. Fortunately, we haven't had to deal with much of that lately with all the safety innovations, although we did lose Kurt Busch to an injury. Dale Jr. had to retire because of his head injuries, didn't want to sustain anymore. So anyhow, you have that. You have, you've lived out your purpose. You can't get a ride. You can't get an owner to talk to you. You're just out of the sport with no options to go anywhere else. That's the reason you leave. And the other reason, most of the time, is financial security. Okay, that's kind of where Martin falls into this. But we'll talk about driver years a little bit. But if you go back in the modern age, what I call, you don't go back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Those guys just showed up and raced and whatever, right? But 80s came along, the late 80s, the 90s, the mid 90s to the 2000s. That's when the money really started getting good for these drivers. It really started accelerating. You take somebody like Bobby Allison. Bobby, one of the best that ever was. Bobby got injured before this big money thing hit, right? And it's pretty well documented that Bobby, he struggled financially through the years after that. Then you take another case like somebody like Cale Yarborough. He was back before the big money thing, but Cale won all these races. He won a lot of races, but Cale was very savvy with his money. I mean, he was frugal. I drove for Cale, loved him to death, but he was frugal. If he made $1, he knew how to make another dollar off that dollar, right? So, and I think in Cale's part, they always talked about Cale could have won a lot more championships and done a lot more, but he didn't want to do all that. He didn't want to race all that because, he had his business interests going on. So financially, he's in pretty good shape, right? And a few other drivers did it like that. But again, if Bobby, when he got hurt, it was the late 80s, close to 90. If Bobby hadn't got hurt, he could have held on and kept driving and maybe got into this money thing where the money was starting to really get big, and he could have walked away from the sport pretty financially secure, but it didn't happen for him that way. The other thing too that went on through the years, the guys, you talk about the guys used to race into the 50s, right? And they did. And I would have, if I hadn't got sick, I'd have probably fell right in there because I was 46 when I got sick and had to leave the sport. But, Harry Gant, 53 years old when he left and still winning races, and you talk about all the guys that, basically 50 years old or a little over 50 when they retire, and you think now the guys are in their early 40s, why? What's the deal? What's going on here? Well, a couple of things. These guys today are starting to race Cup, right, when they're early 20s, so the time they're 40, they've got a 15-year career or 20-year career. A lot of these guys do in their 40s. In our day and before me, actually, a lot of the guys didn't really get going until they was 25 or 30 years old, right? So their driver years or their lifespan in the sport, number of years was the same as the number of years that these guys are going now, okay? So that begs the question of why, what at the end of your career, then what happens? Well, typically, again, you either get hurt or killed or maimed, and we don't have that much anymore. But you cannot. You've lived out your life or your usefulness as far as the sport looks at your talents or your abilities. Okay, and you just don't have the opportunity for optimum rides or good rides. And some of the guys, depending on their financial situation, they will stretch that and stretch it and stretch it. They'll go as long as they can, trying to get their financial situation more secure for retirement. You take somebody like Martin Truex. I mean, it's been obvious for the last couple of years. Martin's driver years, the dog years, driver years, is pretty evident to me anyhow as an outsider. And I do not know Martin Truex. I don't think I've ever spoken to him, but it was pretty obvious to me as an outsider that he'd used up his usefulness year or his useful years in that sport. Why do you have driver years? Why do you live if you're there for a year? You've taken a year and 2 months off your life. Well, you would think, okay, man, you guys, you've got it made. You're making tons of money. You know what I mean? You got airplanes flying around, motorhomes, and on and on and on. And that is true, but that is what makes it bearable. Okay, when you're there, you're doing all that. And all these guys are there now. They're doing the same thing. They're there. They're running on Sunday. They go home. The neat part about being a driver in those situations, that comes Monday morning, that you don't have to get up at 6 o'clock and go clock into the factory or hop on that excavator and start laying pipe, right? Or check in wherever you're going to work and work till 5 that day and do it all week long. As a driver, you don't have to do that, right? So that makes things seem very, very good to you as a driver. You hop in your plane. Of course, you got to pay for all this. You hop in your motorhome. You got to pay for all that. All those things, in my opinion, are helps keep a driver sane, right? Because, and the reason I say that, you work your whole life as a kid coming up through the ranks. Most people, not all, but most people, or a lot of people, when they start racing, they want to get the Cup, or in other forms of racing, whether it be Indy or F1 or whatever. They want to be at the pinnacle, and they work towards that. They work very hard to get there. Well, if you're lucky enough and talented enough to get there, and you're there and you're pretty successful, and you want to stay there, well, that's when the real work starts. That's when the real you'll have soul searching moments. You got daggers thrown at you from every direction, 24 hours a day. You have to learn how to navigate all that. You have to learn how to let stuff go off your shoulder. You have to learn how to deal with criticism. You have to learn how to deal with a sponsor that may want to stay with you or may not, and an owner that needs money and he would like to have you, but is the sponsor going to be there or not going to be there? Is there another team after you? Are you thinking about going there? Is it a step down, a step? And that's all secondary, really, to what you're trying to accomplish on Sunday, and that's run very well or win or place high. Okay, so you've got a zillion things going on as a driver, and over a period of time, when you first get in there, the driver age is probably a year to year, like human age, but the longer you're in the sport, the more that creeps up. Again, it doesn't get to 7 years like a dog year does, okay? But it starts creeping up. There's a point where you go to a 12-month year will be 13 months on your body and your psyche. And if you're in there for 10 years, it's up to 2 months. And if you're in there for 15 years or longer, you're looking at 3 months out of the year that you've lived longer than a year. In other words, a year you're going to live is 15 months total on your psyche and your body. So by the time you've been there again for 15 years, you've probably lived, your psyche and your body. You've lived 18 years. Okay, so what happens in somebody like Martin Truex's case, he was there for a long time, man. He was there for a long time, and those driver years started catching up with him. And the thrill of driving that race car is what I probably feel kept him here the last couple of years. The rest of it was driving him nuts. He's wanting to get out of it, right? But the actual thrill of driving a race car, and we forget about that sometimes with everything that goes on. Listen, folks, it is an honor and a challenge, and one of the most fun things you can do to be able to strap in a Cup car and go out there every Sunday and race against the best in the world. It's just It's exhilarating, okay? And that kind of supersedes everything else that goes on. Well, then you take somebody like Martin's case that, had so many things go wrong, run so good, and so many things go wrong every single week. It seems like, Martin he should have about 3 championships, but now it didn't happen. And all these things, you've already got the driver years that's killing you, all right, that's working on you, not wanting to be putting up with the mess and being around it. Then the thrill of being in that race car is being taken away from you because everything keeps going wrong, right? Well, in Martin's case, he's been there long enough through all the good years, and the financial thing, Martin should be secure for the rest of his life and probably a kid or two, okay, for their lives. So he could walk away from it, feeling pretty good about that. It doesn't always work like that. And then you have guys like somebody like Carl Edwards, he just came in here out of nowhere, very talented, won a bunch of races, garnered tons of fans, the media loved him. And anyhow, he was here really from beginning to end, as compared to other guys, a very short period of time. He made his financial fortune. He left the sport, never to be heard from again, other than now that he's in the Hall of Fame. All right. But, again, nowadays, you start as a driver at 20, and by the time you're in the 40s, or you start in your 20s, and by the time you're in your 40s, you've been here 10, 15, and sometimes longer than that years. Or in the older days, you start like with me, when I talk to everybody, nobody'd hire me till they told me, Rick, how old are you? 28. Well, come back and see us when you're 30, right? We're talking 1988, guys, 1889 when I was told this. And as soon as I turned 30, I had 3 offers in 1991 to drive race cars. All right. So then, you look at 15, 20 years, that puts you closer to 50 years of age, retired and trying to make your fortune to secure yourself. But the time frame is the same. All right. It's just that you start earlier now than what you used to do. But the deal with getting out of the race car, when your career is coming to an end, and everybody feels like they've gotten the most they're going to get out of you, you're not going to be able to produce any better or maybe worse, then that's when you'll lose the good rides, right? And you'll have some other guys that are lesser teams that are offering, and you can beat around in some of that stuff. I'm trying to think. A good case in point was probably Ryan Newman. He probably fits that category. And when your usefulness in our sport is not there anymore, okay, in the eyes of the owners, then you're going to be pushed out of the sport. And hopefully you've been able to accumulate financially enough stuff to, let you live out your life. But, it's funny how that stuff works. I totally understand Martin Truex. I get it. Driver years, man. Always remember driver years. Driver years, not as bad as dog years, but it's longer than just human years. So, I wanted to give y'all just a little sneak preview or a little insight into drivers' careers and how they start in Cup and kind of how they end. So, and then other guys, when they leave, they do other stuff. And here Rick is doing the Rick Mast Show on the Kenny Wallace platform. How friggin' cool is that? Huh? Is that pretty cool? Yeah, I think it is. Peace out, folks.